Salutations, brothers and sisters, and today we shall start talking about The Witcher lore in earnest. And where better to start than with the setting. Now, when I say the Witcher world, I actually really only mean the western coast of one of this world's continents, for you see, this world manages to do something most other fantasy genres forsake, and that is to actually give us maps and accounts of places other than the main setting. Which, while quite realistic, is for the most part unintentional on Sapkowski's part. As you will undoubtedly notice throughout my lore videos, Sapkowski didn't really put much thought into building up his world proper, at least not to the extent of many other fantasy worlds. As such, his world remains largely unmapped, and many of the countries mentioned we never see or hear anything specific about, because, as mentioned previously, for Sapkowski, his world, its countries and regions serve merely as a stage for his stories. CD Projekt Red managed to fill in a few gaps, but never decided to produce a map of the rest of the world for a very simple reason: they didn't need to. As such, there are plenty of unexplored places in the part of the world we know of, and attempting to broaden it would ruin the inadvertent immersion effect of really being stuck in a medieval society with no real knowledge of far-off exotic lands. Ranking the world by level of fantasy involved, if Lord of the Rings or the Elder Scrolls are high fantasy, so 10 approximately, and the Song of Ice and Fire is low fantasy, say 3, The Witcher lands somewhere in between with 6 or 7. For while the setting boasts an impressive number of creatures and a detailed magical system, it is for the most part grounded in real human history. It is also worth noting that this world, at the time of the saga, is going through great changes, as the human society is growing and industrializing, and the numbers of mythical creatures are dwindling, as traditional human religions and superstition take hold. Large-scale settlements are growing, human population is skyrocketing, and ancient forests ruled by eldritch beings are shrinking day by day, leading many humans to abandon traditional life in harmony with nature in favor of a more modern and luxurious existence. One of the major themes of the books is the constant human clash with nature, which humans win more often than not, and fallout from this urbanization. There was a time in this world when all the realms of men would fear to walk alone at night, leave offerings to their local patron deities, and would leave many areas around their village untouched. Now, this is only the case in the most backwards and godforsaken parts of the continent. By the way, I will be referring to the mainland in the story simply as the continent, since it has no official name and I do not feel entitled to give it one either. And most populations now fear their local highwaymen and stray dogs more than werewolves or vampires. In every part of the world, nature is being slowly but steadily pushed back, making new room for man even as we speak. And whilst it is true that nature always finds a way, if our world's history is anything to go by, it will not be anytime soon. Speaking of our history, it is notoriously difficult to pinpoint in exactly which era the Witcher saga takes place due to one main phenomenon: magic. We will return to this later, but many things that in our world have been very recent inventions, for example phones, projectors and other highly technical gadgets, as well as the type of scientific research committed by many mages and scientists, those have already all been developed with the help of magic, and have impacted the world quite drastically. Coupled with the way banks, armies and secret services work, for example, this leads to a highly messy time period. However, if we are going by Central European medieval history, the setting draws most from the 13th to mid-14th century, emulated in the size of cities and settlements, the type of armor and weapons used, the social dynamics in the various nations, as well as the early industrialization characterizing the continent in this age. Fortunately, however, the real-world location equivalents can be deduced much more easily. Though, as I mentioned previously, there are hundreds of nations we know precisely nothing about, the main setting of the saga is the northern part of the continent, the Northern Realms, inspired mostly by Eastern European kingdoms of Poland, Brandenburg, Hungary, Lithuania and Serbia, as well as Western kingdoms such as France, Venice, Switzerland, and Scandinavia. This is self-evident when looking at local names, customs, culture, and folklore, as well as the general role these states fulfill in the story. A secondary setting, the southern realms under Nilfgaard, are a mix of Latin and Germanic inspirations, with no one clear model in your world. This planet is very much similar to our own, in that it has a north, a south, an east, and a west. It has 24 hours per day, 7 days per week, 12 months per year, though the months do have different names derived from Slavic languages, and 4 seasons. The planet is presumably the size of our Earth, since gravity is pretty much the same as on our planet. It has several known climate spheres and habitat types, and no known natural anomalies pertaining its geological structure. The humans of this world are very much like the humans of our world. It is even possible they came to this world from our world, but more on that later. And while they speak distinct languages from our own, they do still share some linguistic features with humans of Earth, and physiologically they are identical, with one major exception: the mutation that allows certain individuals in The Witcher to harness, channel, and utilize magical energies. Now, you might be wondering why I am drooling on and on about comparisons to our world, but patience, all shall become clear soon enough. Aforementioned similarities aside, however, are pretty much where the comparisons end, for the Witcher world is home to several advanced non-human civilizations, hundreds of species of monstrous unnatural fauna and flora, and is to its core seeped with primordial energies known as magic. This esoteric force has affected the world quite profoundly, weaving itself into its nature and affecting everyday society in quite unique ways. For example, despite sharing many species of plants and herbs with our world, these, when mixed with proper otherworldly ingredients, produce effects unheard of in our medicine. The technology, as I already mentioned, while somewhat steampunk, is mostly powered by the powers of chaos, and the mutations it has caused amid animals and men alike can range from very minor, like the ability to channel magical energies, to a 4 meters tall mutated monstrosity known as the Fiend. I will of course explain how magic works in its own separate video, but for now let us delve into the history of the world proper. The prehistory of this world is unknown, and we are not certain who had the honor of being the first sentient race to inhabit the continent. Most point to the gnomes, who are in possession of the oldest documents of their presence in the areas of Mahakam and Tirtocher. However, I need to point out 2 other more obscure and by some accounts older species: the Vrans and the Werebubs, which you can respectively see on the pictures. The picture to the left is Vran, a kind of half lizard, half man creature, which does also have roots in Slavic mythology. And to the left is the Werebub, a hairy, kind of impish character, which does not have any one specific counterpart in Slavic mythology, but hairy little imps are quite common in most Slavic folktales. Both of these races are nearly extinct at the beginning of the story, and precious little is known about them except for their physiology. However, it is known that at least the Vran civilization built cities and aqueducts far older than even the dwarves did, such as Loch Muin, so take this information as you will. However, both of these arguably older races never held much prominence on the continent, and even the gnome society only really became notable after merging with the dwarves. The proud dwarven race were the second species to settle in this region, and in a rare case of common goals and principles, merged very seamlessly with the gnome society. Now, one would think that, seeing as the 2 races valued pretty much the same skills and resources, e.g. mining, metallurgy, jewelry, and smithing, they would become fierce rivals, competing for resources and trying to outdo each other at every possible turn. But strangely, the exact opposite happened, with the dwarves and gnomes merging their societies almost immediately. Now, part of me thinks that this might have something to do with their ancestral heritage, since the dwarves and gnomes are physically very similar in many aspects and might have had a common culture and even language, which would have helped them overcome their respective differences and form the perpetual alliance they find themselves in to this very day. It is unknown if or how the dwarves and gnomes interacted with the Vrans and Werebubs. However, we have no record of a large-scale conflict until the arrival of third race, everyone's favorite pointy-eared princesses, the elves. Now, We have a pretty good idea of how the elves appeared on this world, but the specifics I will discuss later on. For now, all you need to know is that they are not of this world any more than we humans, and that they were also the first race to feud with the native dwarves, gnomes, vrans and werebubs. However, these feuds only ever escalated into small, localized conflicts, and never full-out wars, not because of the benevolence of the newly arrived, but rather because elves and other races rarely shared the same interests. The elves built beautiful palaces and cities in the forests and lowlands, whilst the other races owned the mountains and the valleys, mining their precious resources and not caring much about their new neighbors. It should be noted though that the elves did take over several Vran cities and had local small-scale wars with the dwarves over unknown grievances. The elven society grew to dominate the continent, being virtually unopposed in most places, and seeing as the elves were very good at co-opting nature to their ends, they preserved most of it while doing so. The elves lived for centuries, possessed unrivaled prowess in the mystic arts, and were excellent fighters and general survivors. How could they possibly ever fall from grace? Well, then, the conjunction of the spheres happened. The Witcher world is not the only planet possessed of life in the galaxy, as there are dozens of worlds possessing dozens of life forms, many of which have evolved on a completely different basis of life than ours. Yet many of the inhabitants of these alien worlds were well adapted to a life in our own world, and had the potential to thrive in it should they ever be brought into its ecosphere. Which is exactly what happened during the Clash of the Worlds. Portals opened across dozens of planets and eras, wounds in the time-space continuum, literally begging to be crossed, popping up all around the world. And from these breaches spilled the races of man, eager to explore their new homeland. Now, it is never explicitly stated from which world these races of men came, or even if they came from a single world, seeing as men seemingly inhabit multiple worlds already, but similarities in their language, culture, and general appearance to men of our world suggest that they are in fact family, kindred to you and me. It is, however, worth noting, according to elven sources, the homeworld of men who first settled the continent had been destroyed, either in an unknown cataclysm or by its inhabitants themselves. In that case, while they are still most likely descendants of the men of Earth, they most likely did not arrive on the continent straight from our world. The first tribes of men to settle the continent were the Washgor and the Dauka peoples, a race living in the northern Dragon Mountains. The culture of these people, from what little information we have, was primitive and shamanistic, resembling the Celtic people of our own world, and are in modern day thought to have been mostly assimilated, though some scholars theorize that they are in fact ancestors of the natives of Skellige. Personally, seeing as they were only said to inhabit the northernmost outskirts of the continent, coming into virtually no contact with the other species and almost certainly not traveling as far south as Skellige, I doubt this connection. However, it cannot be denied that Skelligan culture is very distinct from both the habits of Nordlings and Nilfgaardian nations. And seeing as one thing Nordlings did take from the Washgor and the Dauka, namely their gods and religious beliefs, are very similar to those of Skellige Isles, and the theory about the Skelligers being at least distant relatives of these ancient tribes is not entirely without merit, though, again, we have so little information on these cultures that this really is only up to speculation, and you can do with it as you wish. The conjunction is also the first piece of the lore which kinda contradicts itself, namely in suggesting that along with men, magic seeped into the world for the first time. Yet we know for certain that elves, who have been living in this world for a couple thousand years at that point at least, had always been masters of the arcane arts. Indeed, it was the very means of their arrival in the world to begin with. And even if we suppose that the elves actually only came into the world at the same time as the conjunction happened, highly unlikely, the dwarves and gnomes, while not being outspoken sorcerers, were able to channel and magically empower their items even before that. So while it is possible that magic did, so to say, spill out during the conjunction and embed itself in the nature more firmly, it is highly unlikely to have not already existed in the world prior to this point. Therefore, in my opinion, this piece of lore is not accurate and might be a slip-up on part of CD Projekt Red. Or is it? Seeing as the only ones to spread this piece of information are the priests of the internal fire, who see everything that came after the conjunction as wholly evil and demonic, whilst vehemently denying that man came into the world at the exact same moment, this may simply be good old-fashioned propaganda. Who can say for sure? To be fair to the poor priests, though, most creatures that did come through during the conjunction more than earned being described as demonic and inhuman. For alongside men and magic, monsters entered this world, creatures that were never meant to walk the plains and forests of the continent. They came in all shapes and sizes, humanoid, reptilian, insectoid, avian, hybrid, and things too hideous and mutated to describe. They only had two things in common: a burning hatred for silver and an insatiable desire to hunt and kill. They infested the forests, the mountains, the waters, even the skies were now teeming with life forms never before seen in this world. Naturally, many of these creatures immediately started killing each other by the buckets in brutal conflicts for hunting grounds, until only the strongest, cleverest, and meanest remained and adapted themselves to this new biosphere. Not all monsters are mindless hunters, mind you, even though the vast majority are. Several species classified as monsters by men are actually fully or partly sentient, and some even formed societies of their own, sometimes even seamlessly infiltrating and subverting the societies of men and elves. Among these, the most notable are the changeling Dopplers, the higher vampires, the Leshins, godlings, and giants. These creatures speak both the common tongue and their own languages, and have their own developed cultures. The conjunction also created brand new horrors such as the werewolves and the berserkers, creatures born of union between man and beast through wild and powerful magic. Most of these creatures became predators, however, driving the wolves, bears, and mountain lions into obscurity and often extinction. Many of these monsters, after finding their hunting grounds extended into human territory, found they had a taste for human flesh and began terrorizing the early human settlements. A single raid from a short could devastate an entire village, and God save your soul if a griffin ever decided to make itself a rest near your home. Despite these hardships, however, the first human settlers bred quickly enough to replenish their numbers, and even managed to develop uneasy truce with some species of monsters, such as Leshins and giants, so that in exchange for worship, devotion, and sacrifices, they would receive protection from the more bestial denizens to the world. This all happened about 1500 years ago, again, take the timeline with a pinch of salt. Yet the true story of man's ascendance only begins about 500 years ago. That is when the first landing occurred, and when the Nordling exiles landed on the shores of the continent. Now, we do not know the exact location or date of the landing, and we do not know how many ships there were, or whether they landed at the same location. In the north, it would appear that the free city of Novigrad is the most likely location, since it is located at the mouth of a river with a substantial natural harbor, and is located roughly in the middle of the northern coastline. However, there is no actual evidence to substantiate this theory. What we, however, do know is who the ships were carrying: the Nordling exiles. Now, the Nordlings were a race much more brutal and savage than the humble Washgod and Dauka, and these exiles were no exception to that rule. Some speculate that it was precisely their brutal nature that got them exiled from their original homeland beyond the sea. I personally do not subscribe to this idea at all, precisely because of the carnage they proceeded to unleash upon their new neighbors. A tribe of warriors with their skill and fury is not exiled by more civilized people. It is far more likely that they were losers of some great war, defeated by the other tribes and chased beyond the sea. This would also coincide with their historical inspiration, the Slavs and Germans, who were harrowed from their homelands in the Caucasus by the Huns, a race even more brutal than they themselves were. Where the Washgod coexisted with nature and served it, the Nordlings sought to dominate it, and where the Dauka feared and worshipped the woodland beasts, the Nordlings did their best to wipe them out. They quickly defeated and absorbed the native humans, and just like Slavs and Germans, found themselves at the doorstep of a mighty civilization. And just like the Romans, the elves opened their doors to them. There was little empathy in the elves' decision to try and integrate humans into their societies. The elves saw us humans for the unwashed savages we were, too crude and blunt to ever be a threat to their society. They probably wished to utilize the humans same way the Romans tried to utilize their barbarians, as cheap and easy mercenaries and free workforce. However, the most pressing matter for the elves was their decreasing population. Elves quickly discovered, probably through human prostitution, that they could reproduce with humans much faster than with other elves, and this would be a population boost they sorely required to keep their society working. And so they let the race of men into their cities and into their beds and showed them their talents and gave them the taste of their riches. Yeah, this was never going to end well for the elves, now was it?
No.
Yet the biggest mistake elvenkind made when dealing with these new and ambitious savages was to teach their gifted individuals magic, to share with the humans the secrets of the arcane arts. Granted, we are not sure why they made such a foolish decision, but it may have also been one of utility, as untrained mages and especially sorcerers can be remarkably destructive if untrained. Yet the Savern, the elven sages, greatly underestimated the talent man showed in these arts and the natural human desire to conquer and dominate. Soon, one after another, the tribes of man declared war on the cities of elves and drove them ever further from the sea, one bloody war at a time. The elves had hoped that their half-human offspring would fight on their side, yet most of them sided with their fathers and killed those they were one day meant to replace. Many elves, seeing the onslaught, attempted to withdraw into the mountains. "We are long-lived," they argued. "Men's lives are but sparks in a fire. They will soon burn out and then we can return." Yet many elves wished to stay and fight. The youngsters, the elves who were still fresh, not tired from an ageless life of loss. And off they marched to reclaim their cities and drive men back into the sea. Off they went to die. After the last elven warriors were slaughtered, the remaining non-humans had a choice: exile into the wilderness, into the furthest reaches of the Blue Mountains and away from the society, or stay and adapt to a life of second-class citizens. Most dwarves, gnomes and halflings chose the latter. For one, they possessed talents and skills that made them more valuable to humans, and they were also less prideful and more akin in nature to humans, blending into their societies more easily than the remorseful and ever-proud elves. Yet even they were often persecuted, disadvantaged and massacred for any number of reasons. To this day, racial tensions in the north are extremely high. But to the victors go the spoils, and the Nordling tribes suddenly found themselves ruling over enormous swaths of land and resources. So naturally, they started squabbling and fighting each other over who gets the biggest chunk. The wars that followed immediately after the human conquest were said to be even more brutal than the conquest itself, as the tribes, until this point forced to cooperate and fight in unison, finally settled old grudges and let loose their accumulated rage for one another. Out of the madness and bloodshed of these wars, several kingdoms arose, which would later be the foundations for modern northern states, foremost amongst them the big four of Redania, Temeria, Kedwen and Edirn. Yet there was one foe yet to defeat. For while the elves and dwarves may have been defeated and subjugated, the forces of nature were still challenging man every step of the way. Monsters still destroyed entire settlements, killing hundreds at a time and hindering any effort to tame the wilderness. Sometimes men would be able to gang up on a single beast, but it would always come at a heavy cost, and the monster would usually retreat back into its impenetrable wilderness, into the depths of its lair where not even the bravest human warriors dared to follow. Human sorcerers knew they would need a new weapon to deal with these creatures, not a knight in shining armor, but a hunter, able to track these beasts down and take them on one at a time. An assassin, able to operate quickly and effectively. They did not need a hero. They needed a professional. And so, they created one. But that, friends, is a story for another day.
At the end of the path, I rest my weary feet. At the end of the path, in quiet comfort.